In this lecture, you're going to learn how to process payments with Stripe on the front end whenever a user clicks a button. And to start, let's actually configure that button so that it only appears whenever a user is actually logged in. So here on the tour detail page, right now we have a user logged in, and so that button says Book Tour Now. But it should only be like this when there is a currently logged in user. And otherwise, it should then redirect us to the login page. Okay, so let's implement that in the tour template. And so that's actually right here. So that is this button. All right. Now, if there is currently a user logged in, then that means that we have access to the user variable. And so we can do if user, well, then this. And if there is no user, so else, well, then we simply want to display a button which brings us to the login page. And so login to book tour. And this one should actually be a link. And so we need an A element for anchor. And then let's also specify the href property, which again will point us to the login page. All right. Now here we also need to add an ID, book tour, so that we can then select it in our JavaScript. And also something very important is that we should put the current tour ID right here in this element. Okay. Now why is that so important? Well, remember how the API endpoint that we just created, so this one here, needs the tour ID. And so that tour ID needs to come from somewhere, basically. And so right now, we don't have that information anywhere on this page. And so we will put it here right on this element so that then our JavaScript file can grab it from here and send it along with the request to the checkout session route. Okay? So just like we did here with the map, we are going to use a data attribute. And so that's data dash, and then basically whatever variable name we want to define. And so that's tour ID in this case. So tour.id. All right. So give this a save and let's actually try that out now. So reload the page. And first of all, let's inspect it to see if the ID is actually there. And indeed, here we go. And now if we log out, then let's see what we have. And indeed, now it says log in to book the tour. Great. And let's do that actually. Okay. And so now next up, let's create a script in which we will actually do the request and process the payment on the front end. And so just like before, that will be in public and then JavaScript. So one more script here. And I'm going to call it stripe.js. And now here we actually need access to the Stripe library again. But that package that we just installed before, so remember that Stripe npm package that we used here, so this one only works for the backend. And what we need to do on the front end is to actually include a script in the HTML. And since we only need that script here on the tour page, we will do it just like we did with the Mapbox script. So this one, we will put it here in this head block. All right. Now, which script do we actually need? Well, that we can very simply get from the documentation that we already took a look at before. And I hope you didn't close that one. All right. And so again, this one here explains how we use the checkout product both on the client and the server. So here we see that we have two steps. First, creating the checkout session on the server. And so this is very similar to what we did before in the last video. And so now we need to also add it to our front end. And so that script that we need is this one. All right. So let's copy that and let's go back. And now we need to adapt this a little bit. All right. So this will then expose a Stripe object to the global scope. And so now in this file, we can use that. So we say const stripe equals, and then this is that object that we get from the script that we just included. And then here we need our public key. All right. So we already used our secret key on the backend. Now it's time to use our public key. So let's go back to the dashboard. And actually, if you're in the documentation, it will already show up here for you. So this is a really nice feature of the Stripe documentations. So whenever you're logged in, then this key that you have here is actually your public key. But if you're not on that page, you can of course also get your API key by going to the home page or the developers page. Let's actually try that one. Then here on API keys, you have your public test key right here. So grab that, and then let's go back and pass it here. And just as before, I want to quickly disable ESLint here. Okay, and now let's then finally create a function that I'm going to call book tour. Okay, and so this function will take in a tour ID. And so that tour ID is the one that's going to be coming right here from this user interface. So right from here. Okay, so just as before, we're going to get that one from index.js, where we will then also call this book tour. Okay, so very similar to what we did before. Anyway, let's now once more specify the steps that we're going to take here. So the first step is to actually get the session from the server. And so that is where now this route here comes in. Okay, so this is the point where we are going to use this endpoint to really get our checkout session onto the client side. Okay, so get checkout session from endpoint or from API. It doesn't really matter. And then as a second step, we will use our Stripe object to basically automatically create the checkout form plus process, or let's say plus charge the credit card for us. Okay, and that's actually it. So only two simple steps, and you will see that they are actually pretty simple. So let's store the session into a variable called session. And then we're going to await an HTTP request, which once more we will do with Axios. All right, so I need to grab that here. So import Axios, and once more I'm using the ES6 module syntax. Remember that, from Axios. So just like we did, for example, in login or in update settings, right? Now we also need to mark this function here as async. Okay, and then into Access, we can simply just pass the URL when all we want to do is a simple GET request. Okay, so up until this point, we have always specified the method and the URL and the data, but now we're only doing a GET request. And so that's then much simpler. Let's just grab the URL here so that we don't lose more time. Then here it's API/v1/bookings. Then checkout session. And then the tour ID. So that's this one here, which is going to get passed into this function. Okay? And let's actually take a look at this session object in our console, just to see if everything works. Okay? So now in our index.js, we will basically connect that green button with this function that we just created inside of stripe.js. So import book tour from Stripe. Then, as always, let's select our element from the web page. So book button is equal to document.getElementById, and the ID, remember, is book tour, I believe. So yeah, so that's the ID that we just added before, book ID. And so now we can add that event handler to it. So if there is a book button, then book button dot add event listener waiting for a click. Then we need the event as well. And now we need to get that tour ID from that button. So that's tour ID equals, and now a nice trick here, which is e.target. And maybe you're familiar with that. So event.target is basically the element which was clicked. So the one that triggered this event listener here to be fired. All right, and so that will be, of course, this button. Then in there we have tour ID. And so in JavaScript, that will then actually be called tour. So like this, let me just write it out. So tour ID. So whenever there is a dash, it will automatically get converted to this camel case notation. Okay, so e.target.dataset.tour ID. But now, since this name is exactly the same as this one, we can simply use destructuring on that. So once more, using this nice trick. And then we call book tour with that tour ID. And another nice thing that we can do here is to change the text of the button to something like processing. And so let's do again e.target. So again, the element that was clicked. So that's the button. Dot text content, which we used before up here. So to change the text in an element, and let's change that to processing. Okay, and so with this, I think we have everything correctly connected. So we click on that button, then we change the text on that button, then we get the tour ID from that data attribute that's on the button and call book tour with that ID. Okay, and so that ID will then get passed onto this URL, which in turn should return a checkout session. Okay, and then here we're going to take a look at that, just like this. Now at this point, we will not create the checkout form just yet, so we're going to leave that for the last step of this video. But for now, I want to take a look at this. Let's just see if Parcel is still running here in the background. So bundling all our scripts together, and it looks like it is. And so let's now actually test this out. So we are logged in. Let's now try the park camper. Down here, click this button, and it seems like we don't get any error, so that's good. Now let's take a look at our console, and we have an object, and so that is the result of this Axios call. So Axios always creates an object like this, where in there is an object called data, which is the actual response. And so here you see that we indeed have our session. So you see we have the customer email, we have the current tour ID, we have, well, let's see if we have, so here we have some data about the tour. And so, yeah, everything looks correct here. All right, so let's close that. And now as the last step, let's then actually create basically this checkout form and charge the credit card. All right, and actually let's also wrap all of this here into a try catch block, because of course we have some asynchronous calls here, and we'll have one more in a second, and so it's a good practice to have a try catch block. All right, But let's not waste a lot of time with these errors. But I'm still going to show actually an alert in case there is an error. So for example, with this API call, okay, so that the user basically can see that something went wrong. So let's simply grab this alerts import. All right, and then say show alert, specifying that it's an error, and then just the error itself as the message basically. All right. Anyway, in order to now do this last step, it's actually very, very simple. All we have to do is to await stripe.redirect to checkout. Let me see if I got this wrong. And let me see if I got that right. So redirect to checkout. All right. And then options, but only one option, which is the session ID. And so that's going to be coming from session. And remember how the session was inside of data. So there was a data object created in there by Axios, remember? And so that is then our response itself. And so in there we have session.id. And that's it. Okay? And so now comes the greatest part of all, which is to actually check out if this works. So we are still logged in. Let's just one more time reload this. Click our button and now wait for it. And indeed, we get to our checkout page. And also we get this nice image here. We get our Nature's logo here. We get here our icon. So all the stuff that we specified before. We have the price that we also specified in our checkout session. And really all the other details. So the name, the summary, and of course the image. That's really amazing, right? Then here another great thing that I mentioned before is that the email address is already automatically pre-filled. So that's another really nice feature. And so now here all we need to do is to put in this credit card information. And so with Stripe, when we're testing, the credit card number is just 4242 4242 and so on until we're done. Okay? Then here any month and any year works. So let's just put 222. So anything in the future. All right? So if you're watching this course after February 2022, then this date is not going to work. So then just put something later. Okay, and here any number works as well. Here any name works as well. Let's just put Laura. The country, of course, also doesn't really matter. It will automatically pre-fill based on your IP location. So I'm in Portugal, and so that's what I get. And now you see this nice green button here, and it has this nice effect. And so now when we click it, it's processing, and we're done. Great. Then this is actually the success URL that we also specified in our checkout session, right? So we defined that, that in the event of a success, we moved back to this home URL. And we're going to change that here a bit later. But for now, this is really what we wanted. And so it worked perfectly fine. Well, at least I hope so. So let's take a look at our payments now. And indeed, this is the one that we just made. So we successfully received this payment right in our account now. So you see the email address, the name, and indeed the park camper tour that we just purchased. Great. That's really awesome. So down here you can then see the fees that Stripe takes. So of course they also need to make money, and so therefore they take a cut, which I think is like 2.9% or something like that. But of course, all that stuff you can check out on their website. Then you also got the payment method here. So the data that we just put in. And you get some nice data about the session. And probably she should also show up here in your customers. And yeah, indeed, here she is. And so Yeah, I think that is pretty successful now. Oh, and another thing that I forgot to mention is that your users will actually also automatically get an email. So I think that should be the default here in email receipts. So go to your settings, email receipts, and then here you have email customers about successful payments. And so that's also a really nice feature, meaning that we do not have to manually send out emails whenever a user successfully purchased a tour. All right. So one more thing that Stripe takes away from us. Fantastic. So let's now just take a quick minute to recap the entire process that we just went through. So we started by creating this checkout session, which needs as an input the tour ID so that we can then store a bunch of details about the tour in that session. So stuff about the tour name, the summary, also the price, images. So all that stuff that we want to show up on the checkout page, but also in our dashboard. Then we also include the email so that the user doesn't need to fill it out in the checkout, and then a bunch of other data. So remember this client reference ID, which will make a lot more sense once we actually get to use it. So we create this session whenever someone hits this checkout session route, all right? And so that's exactly what we then do on our front end right here in stripe.js. So we get our session here, and then from there, we create a checkout and charge the credit card using stripe.redirect to checkout. And the Stripe object here is simply using the Stripe library with our public key, okay? Now, where does this tour ID come from? Well, it is stored here right on the button where the user clicks to book a new tour. That ID is then read right here in index.js whenever someone hits the booking button, okay? So we store that into tour ID and pass it into book tour, which again is this function here, which takes care of really processing the payments on the front end. And so the result of all this is what we just saw before, where the user really got charged the credit card and purchased the tour. So perfect. Now what's missing here is that actually whenever there is a new booking, we want to create a new booking document in our database. So just as we discussed way back when we talked about our data model in this application, right? And so to that end, we're going to create the bookings model right in the next video so that after that, we can then create new tours whenever there is a successful purchase.